In Montreal, what immediately stood out to me was the city's architecture. There's a ton of history here.
Old Montreal. It's all about history.
Layers upon layers upon layers.
There is so much to see, especially here in Montreal, the old town. It feels like you've been transported to another world, or at least Europe.
Old Montreal's architecture dating from the 17th century through to the 19th century is a rarity in North America and is considered one of the oldest urban areas on the continent. 3 square kilometers of old building stock line the narrow cobblestone streets here, celebrating one of the most romantic eras of architectural history.
Look at this church. Everything is so cute here.
This house, Pierre de Calvet,
dates back to 1725.
His house is actually quite famous. Pierre de Calvet housed Benjamin Franklin. So this is where Benjamin Franklin lived. Americans were here trying to recruit the French to fight against the British and get the British out of British North America. And what Benjamin Franklin did is he brought something to Montreal that didn't exist before, a printing press. Benjamin Franklin actually stayed and with a group of Montrealers founded one of the oldest newspapers in North America, still around today, the Montreal Gazette.
There are a lot of cool buildings, and a lot of them will have little plaques on them that'll tell you the historical significance to the city.
St. Lawrence Hall, 139 St. James, from 1851 to 1910, which was one of Montreal's more important hotels. The hotel was demolished and replaced by offices in 1910.
Some type of historic stuff happened there. We're gonna go figure out what it is.
Late in 1864, there was a Confederate walking those very same Montreal streets. The man who would become Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth.
Montreal was a major site for Confederate agents operating out of Canada. The city had earned the title of Little Richmond because of all the Confederate agents that had located there and all of the Confederate gold that had been deposited in her banks.
The Confederates liked Canada. They loved Canadians. They thought the Canadians were like them.
Montrealers warmed to the Southerners during a time when many were not keen on Abraham Lincoln.
St. Lawrence Hall was the headquarters to several Confederate agents, including a man by the name of Patrick Charles Martin, who ran the office in Montreal.
If Booth wanted to meet with high-ranking members of the Confederate government, Montreal was his best bet.
Following Lincoln's death, witnesses alleged they had seen Booth chatting up Confederate officials at the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel and heard him expressing open contempt for Lincoln.
Was the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln first hatched in a Montreal hotel?
Booth received substantial and critical help from the Confederate Secret Service that was operating in Canada.
A great actor, Booth performed regularly in Montreal, stayed at the posh St. Lawrence Hall, and occasionally liked to shoot his mouth off.
Booth's remarks over a game of billiards in the hotel's saloon suddenly became significant 6 months later.
He was drinking hard one night at the St. Lawrence Hall, playing pool. He said to somebody else at the bar, he said, "It doesn't matter who wins the election, because Abe's goose is cooked." And this was later printed in the Hamilton Times, picked up by the New York Times, and that also fueled the Canadian conspiracy.
When authorities cornered and killed Booth in Virginia, he was carrying a bill of exchange from Montreal's Ontario Bank dated October 27, 1864. A bank book from the same institution, stamped with the same date, was also discovered among his belongings. Sensational American newspaper coverage spoke of Canada's complicity in their president's murder. There were calls for retribution.
The question is, can you tie the Canadian Secret Service operation directly to Jefferson Davis?
The family of Jefferson Davis was sheltered in Montreal during and after the Civil War. The Confederate president eventually made Montreal his home in the years after his cause was defeated.
Lincoln's murder may have been one of the final skirmishes of the Civil War, and the Confederacy's last desperate attempt to prevail over the Union.
Abraham Lincoln, long considered one of America's greatest presidents, met his fate at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. on the night of April 14, 1865. The true motives of his assassin, an actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, have been debated since that night. But regardless of what Booth's ends may have been, his action changed history and the course of a nation.
26-year-old John Wilkes Booth was an actor of national fame, considered by some the handsomest man in America. He was also deeply committed to the Confederate cause.
By the third year of the Civil War, it was pretty much very difficult for the South to see a way to succeed. But what they thought was if they started a two-front war and could drag Canada into it, then Lincoln might sue for peace.
Despite neutrality, Canadians largely supported the Union. Slavery had been completely abolished in Canada by 1834. Some 40,000 American slaves, many from the South, escaped to Canada before the Civil War and brought with them a disdain for the southern states.
But in unlikely places like Montreal and Toronto, the Confederates found a sympathetic ear. They feared the aggression of the North and what would happen when the war ended.
Maritimers were particularly sympathetic to the South, as many desired their own independence.
Many Confederates liked to escape the sweltering summers of the U.S. South by vacationing in Quebec's eastern townships. Confederates used Montreal as a base during the American Civil War because of its sophistication and good communications network.
The Confederates traveled here frequently, even made plans to turn the tide of the war.
A select group of agents were sent up to Canada with the idea of wreaking havoc against the North in a variety of ways.
Wednesday, October 19th, 1864, not 30 kilometers from the Canadian border in St. Albans, Vermont. That's exactly what the Confederates had in mind. They hoped a skirmish would attract the attention of already nervous British and Canadian officials, maybe even get them to take up arms against the Union.
Confederate agents crossed the border and robbed 3 banks in St. Albans, Vermont, killing a U.S. citizen and escaping with $170,000. The Union pursued them across the Canadian border, creating an international incident.
The plan was simple. Herd the townspeople into the park, rob all the banks, use a chemical called Greek fire to try and burn the town down, then ride for Canada.
The Canadians eventually arrested the Confederate raiders. A Canadian court ruled that because they were soldiers under military orders, officially neutral Canada could not extradite them.
The British felt obligated to arrest the raiders, but they were treated like guests, not prisoners, wined and dined. Here they are posing for pictures in front of the Montreal courthouse. None of them ever were convicted. And the money?
Amazingly, Canada freed the raiders, but returned what money was found. The raid turned many Canadians against the Confederacy. The Confederate agents in Canada realized this, and no further raids were made.
As the 1864 presidential election drew near, the Confederacy's prospects for victory were ebbing, and the tide of war increasingly favored the North.
The impossible had happened. General Sherman took Atlanta in a huge blow to the Confederacy. The victory was the morale boost that the Union needed and helped to revive Lincoln's popularity in the North. John Wilkes Booth was worried about this resurgence of Lincoln's popularity and began to actively concoct an audacious plan to make Lincoln a prisoner of the Confederacy. John Wilkes Booth began working on this plot and recruited the first 2 active conspirators into it.
John Surratt meets John Wilkes Booth, and this fellow here introduces them. That's Dr. Samuel Mudd, and Booth and Surratt became very close. And around this time, the Surratt family moved to Washington, D.C. And was it a coincidence that they moved at the same time that Surratt and Booth started talking? We don't really know. But we also know it began to hum with activity and with a conspiracy. There were, in the Booth conspiracy, at least 9 people. This fellow was Lewis Payne. He was a Confederate veteran, a large fellow. George Atzerodt was a German immigrant. He ran boats on the Potomac River, and he was to get them across the river. David Herold, he knew all the secret highways and byways, and he was the one who was going to whisk them secretly through. And they all became habitués of the Surratt house. They either came by, spent nights there, and met with Mary, with John, and with Booth.
Booth and his team's initial plan was not to kill Lincoln. It was to kidnap him. The thought being that they could kidnap Lincoln, they could somehow get him to the southern states, back behind Confederate lines, and then they could negotiate.
Now, it was a pretty crazy plan.
With the plan fully formed in his mind and a few recruits in his corner, John Wilkes Booth decided to take his plan to men who would accept and support his vision. He would seek recognition and assistance from the Confederacy itself.
Booth did not look south, but surprisingly, he turned north to Canada. On October the 16th, 1864, Booth crossed over the border into Canada, and on the 18th of October, registered at St. Lawrence Hall, a hotel in Montreal. Booth was in Montreal for a total of 10 days, from October the 18th until the 27th. During those 10 days, he was seen on at least 2 occasions meeting with Patrick Martin. Martin had been a blockade runner who had moved to Montreal in 1862 to become one of the agents working for the Confederate Secret Service. At least one of those meetings between Booth and Martin occurred in a Montreal bank where Booth purchased a cashier's cheque for 61 pounds Canadian. In addition, he opened a savings account with the same Ontario bank for $455, the equivalent of $5,500 today.
The Ontario Bank, a place where Confederates did business. Even John Wilkes Booth had a bank account here.
Witnesses alleged they had seen Booth chatting up Confederate officials at the St. Lawrence Hall Hotel and heard him expressing open contempt for Lincoln. He was quoted as saying, "It makes little difference, head or tail, whether he wins the election. Abe's contract is near up, and whether re-elected or not, he will get his goose cooked." He was later heard saying, "I like this Canadian style. I must post myself in Canuck airs, for some of us may have to settle here shortly."
And he stayed for 10 days, and when he left, he carried a letter of introduction from that Confederate agent to Dr. Mudd and a man named Dr. William Queen. Both lived in Charles County, Maryland. And if you think about that, it ties Booth and Dr. Mudd into the Confederate Secret Service directly. And it means that Patrick Martin in Montreal knew Dr. Mudd and knew that he was the man John Wilkes Booth needed to see.
After Booth's return from Montreal, he laid low for a few days and did not take any active steps in his plot. He was likely waiting to see how the election of 1864 would play out, in the faint hope that Lincoln would not win re-election. But Lincoln was re-elected, and by a large majority. 3 days later, John Wilkes Booth took the stagecoach from Washington down into Charles County with his letters of introduction in hand. His plot would move forward.
Interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth was actually in attendance at Lincoln's inauguration. So here's a photo of that event. Booth would later comment to friends of his that he was so close to Lincoln that he could have shot him if he'd wanted to.
By March of 1865, this conspiracy is ready to try to kidnap Lincoln. And the plan was to waylay Lincoln as he was going to see a theatrical performance at the Campbell Hospital in Washington.
Intercept Lincoln in March of 1865 while he was on the road, but a change in the president's schedule nixed that idea.
Booth's scheme to kidnap Lincoln was no longer feasible with the Union Army's capture of Richmond and Lee's surrender, and he changed his goal to assassination.
It is commonly repeated that John Wilkes Booth made his plan to kill Abraham Lincoln on the morning of April 14th, when he went to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail, and learned that the Lincolns would be attending the theater that night. This statement, however, is only half right. Booth had already been planning the assassination since April 11th at the latest, and it was merely the venue that changed when he learned of Lincoln's attendance at Ford's.
The previous day, Booth was in the crowd outside the White House when Lincoln gave an impromptu speech from his window. During the speech, Lincoln stated that he was in favor of granting suffrage to the former slaves. Infuriated, Booth declared that it would be the last speech that Lincoln would ever make.
The Lincolns and their guests arrive at Ford's in high spirits.
The crowd applauds the president. They stop the play. They sit down, and the play begins.
As Booth makes his way toward the presidential box, he is seen, but no one stops him.
He was well known to everyone, a popular actor, of course, and that let Booth get right behind Lincoln.
As the crowd roars with laughter, Booth takes aim.
$1 an old man. So that moment where the whole future looked like had finally lifted, the clouds had separated, comes crashing down.
The bullet enters the back of Lincoln's head.
Booth stepped up to him, fired a shot from perhaps 3-4 inches, not right against Lincoln's head, but close, and it hit Lincoln in the back of the head, like a sledgehammer would. This is the derringer that Booth used on April 14. It's about 6 inches long, weighs about 8 ounces.
A part of the Ford's Theater collection, this instrument of history was Booth's personal weapon.
It fires a single bullet, so this is like we say, one and done. Booth dropped the pistol, went to the front of the box intending to escape. Major Rathbone jumped from his seat. He grabbed Booth from behind and pulled him back from the railing. Booth twisted around in the Major's grip, and for the first time the men were face to face. And Rathbone later said he was absolutely horrified by the look on Booth's face. And Booth was stronger than Rathbone was, so he was able to free himself and slash Rathbone with a knife.
Yeah. Booth leaps from the box to the stage.
Sic semper tyrannis!
And makes his escape.
One of the things that may be hard for people to kind of comprehend is the lack of security that the president had at this point in time in history. There was no Secret Service.
Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, succumbed to his injuries and died the following day at 7:22 a.m.
The man who had freed the slaves and given hope to the disenfranchised was gone. Abraham Lincoln now belonged to the ages.
The president was dead. The atmosphere in the theater turned to chaos. Soldiers flooded the building. Booth knew he had to flee the city as quickly as possible. A co-conspirator had arranged for a horse to be waiting for him at the stage door. Booth jumped on the steed and crossed the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. Booth was met on the other side by conspirator David Harold. They rode together to a town called Surrattsville, Maryland. There they went to Surratt's Tavern, whose proprietors were hiding some supplies for the men. Knowing that the army would be hot on their trail, they didn't stay long. They gathered what they needed, armed themselves heavily, and headed back on the road. At 4 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, Booth and Harold arrived at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. Mudd set Booth's broken leg and let the two men rest at his home for a few hours. Over 1,000 Union soldiers had been mobilized to search for Booth, and a bounty placed on the conspirators had reached $100,000, roughly the modern equivalent of $1.5 million.
Incidentally, the man who led the posse, Edward P. Doherty, was born in Canada.
Quebec-born First Lieutenant Edward Doherty was tasked to lead the hunt for Booth.
Edward Paul Doherty, the highest profiled Canadian that was ever involved in the American Civil War, was born in Wickham, present-day Quebec. He attended school in Montreal and graduated from St. Hyacinth College.
For nearly 2 weeks, 2,000 Union soldiers scoured the countryside searching for his assassin.
On the morning of April 23rd, the fugitives reached Virginia. On April 24th, Booth and Harold reached a farmhouse owned by a man named Richard Garrett, whom they did not know. Booth, perhaps using his acting skills, convinced Garrett that he and Harold were soldiers and that Booth's leg had been broken in the course of his duties. Garrett fell for the ruse and gave the men a place to sleep for the night. The following day, Booth slept late, got drunk, and by that evening the family had grown suspicious of the fugitives and insisted they spend the night in the barn. Booth agreed and headed to his new lodging for some sleep. It would be the last night of sleep he would ever get.
On April the 26th at 4 a.m., a cavalry detachment surrounded a tobacco barn on Garrett Farm in Virginia. They had been told that inside was one of the most notorious criminals of the century, or of any age.
John Wilkes Booth, you are surrounded!
The Union forces surrounded the barn. They had orders from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to take Booth alive, so a standoff ensued. Harold, for his part, begged Booth to let him surrender. Booth agreed and let Harold go, but he had other plans for himself.
The man who surrendered was not John Wilkes Booth, but 21-year-old David Harold, known to be one of Booth's co-conspirators. Lieutenant Edward Doherty grew impatient. He gave the command to smoke out his quarry.
Booth scrambled for the back door, armed with a rifle and pistol. Captain Doherty sprang towards the barn, and as he did so, Booth raised a gun, and it was then that Sergeant Boston Corbett shot Booth.
The soldiers were under strict orders to take Booth alive, but an overzealous sergeant named Boston Corbett took matters into his own hands. 2 soldiers dragged the body from the raging inferno. The nation was avenged.
Booth was laid on the porch of Garrett House and died around sunrise.
In his final moments, Booth asked one of the soldiers to hold up his hand so he could see them. The soldiers obliged, and while looking over his hand, Booth spoke his final words: "Useless, useless." Then at 7:15 a.m., John Wilkes Booth shuffled off his mortal coil.
Doherty and his men took their prisoner, David Harold, as well as Booth's corpse, back to Washington. For his service, First Lieutenant Doherty received a promotion to captain, as well as $5,250. Doherty succumbed to heart disease and died in his home on April 5, 1897. Doherty was buried in Section 1 of Arlington National Cemetery. His tombstone reads, "Commanded Detachment of 16th New York Cavalry, which captured President Lincoln's assassin, April 26, 1865.
Back in Washington, D.C., thousands of people came out to watch the funeral procession that carried Lincoln's body to the Capitol building. A private service was held for important figures and those close to Lincoln. The following day, the rotunda was opened to the public. Citizens came in droves to say goodbye to their president. The following day, his body was loaded onto a special train that would carry it to its final resting place in Springfield, Illinois.
Eventually, Booth's body was secretly buried in the basement of the old naval prison in Washington.
Whether we like it or not, John Wilkes Booth will forever be entwined with Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, thousands disliked Abraham Lincoln. Hundreds likely wished him dead. Dozens fantasized about murdering him, and a handful may have made active plans to do it. But in the end, John Wilkes Booth was that one person, and perhaps the only person whose life had aligned itself so purposefully to the task of becoming our nation's first presidential assassin. So, did John Wilkes Booth receive the blessing and backing of the Confederate officials in Montreal? In truth, we do not know.
What he did in Montreal is still a matter of dispute. 2 days before Booth was shot, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wrote, quote, "This department has information that the president's murder was organized in Canada and approved at Richmond." Through his bank account, Booth's link to Montreal endured after he himself was gunned down. When authorities cornered and killed Booth in Virginia, he was carrying a bill of exchange from Montreal's Ontario Bank dated October 27, 1864.
The draft for 61 pounds was recovered from Booth's body at the Garrett farm, and Booth's Ontario bank book showing the $455 in savings was found at the Kirkwood House in George Atzerott's room, where he registered on the morning of April 14th, the day of the assassination.
Author Clayton Gray explains, he had that in his pocket, which is why everybody called it a Canadian connection to the assassination. His account at the Ontario Bank, an institution acquired by the Bank of Montreal in 1906, stayed open with a balance of $455 for an undetermined length of time following his death. The Booth family didn't want to have anything to do with that account. The cash had been described over the years as blood money. Sensational American newspaper coverage spoke of Canada's complicity in their president's murder. There were calls for retribution. The rising tide of hatred led Canadians to renew their demand for Confederation that the Civil War had turned from a good idea to a necessity. Canada had to create itself to save itself.
The tension between the US and Britain further expedited the need for a united Canada. The Dominion of Canada was formed on July 1st, 1867, only 2 years and 3 months after the end of the American Civil War.
In many ways, today's divided America and united Canada are the twin legacies of John Wilkes Booth's actions. Booth's other conspirators were captured and brought to trial. The prosecution sought to prove their guilt along with the complicity of what it called the Confederacy's Canadian cabinet.
Despite the Union government's best efforts to tie the Confederacy into Lincoln's death at the trial of 1865, the government could not prove its case. Many books have been written attempting to prove that Booth's plan was approved by the Confederate government, but the smoking gun is just not there. And today, 151 years later, it still cannot be proven.
Booth's meetings with Patrick Martin, his financial dealings with Montreal Bank that were facilitated by Martin, all link Booth to the Confederate operation in Canada. While that link may be circumstantial, it surely is not without credible evidence.
Another conspirator in Lincoln's assassination, John Surratt Jr., was also a frequent visitor to Montreal. Surratt spoke fondly of the city, and it was there he bought his prized Garibaldi jacket, which he was often seen wearing. When the assassination happened, he took off back to Canada. It was a Montreal priest that hid him and eventually scurried him out of the country and over to Europe, where he could escape justice.
His mother, Mary Surratt, was convicted of conspiracy by a military tribunal and hanged. She owned the boarding house that the conspirators used as a safe house and to plot the scheme.
These were the other three conspirators. They, along with Mary Surratt, were all put on trial and were executed.
Lincoln himself still has a footprint in Montreal nearly 160 years after his death. McGill University houses one of the biggest Lincoln exhibitions outside of the United States. Among the objects on display is a piece of cloth the attending doctor wrapped around Lincoln's head after Booth shot him. It is still stained with the president's blood.
It's been there since 1957, and now it's come down. Put up by the Society of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, it commemorates Jefferson Davis. The plaque was put there for a reason. Davis sent his family to live in Montreal during the Civil War. Davis was imprisoned for treason, and when out on bail, he joined his family.
The family of Jefferson Davis was sheltered in Montreal during and after the Civil War in a house on Union Avenue downtown. 2 years after the war, Jefferson Davis escaped to Canada, partly to join his family and partly because his secret papers regarding the Confederacy were hidden in the vault of the Bank of Montreal. Eventually, they settled into a house that still stands today at 1181 Mountain Street, where he began writing his famous defense of the Confederacy, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government.
Andrew Pappenheim, an American student studying at McGill, walked by the plaque every day. In May, he got in touch with the Bay, asking them to remove it.
As events in the States become more chaotic, I'm viewing it in a darker and darker light.
Most of the commemorations, like the plaque in Montreal, went up in the 1950s as a reaction to the civil rights movement. As for what will happen to the plaque, no one from the Bay would comment.
The bizarre connections between Quebec's largest city and American assassins doesn't end there. Montreal also had strange ties to two other infamous assassinations. James Earl Ray, the man who killed Martin Luther King Jr., lived in Montreal in 1967 and 68 after escaping from Missouri State Penitentiary. He lived in a now-demolished apartment building located at 2589 Notre Dame East, near the Jacques Cartier Bridge. He disappeared in early 1968, only to resurface a few months later in Memphis, where he murdered Dr. King on April 4th. JFK assassin Lee Harvey Oswald was also spotted in Montreal only 3 months before killing President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, in Dallas. Oswald was seen handing out pamphlets at Square Victoria, next to the Montreal World Trade Center. The RCMP and FBI also confirmed that Oswald's personal revolver, although mail-ordered in California, came from Montreal.
I love me a historical city, and Montreal is one of them.
Montreal is widely considered the most haunted city in all of Canada, and there's a reason for that. Layers upon layers upon layers of history, of course.